think what I like the most about Nolan's The Odyssey is that it's a movie that's in discord not only with the text that it is an adaptation of, but also the context of the text and the discourse about the text in the years to come, and to show the fact that it's in discourse of the surrounding of the text. I think he made the deliberate choice of making a um, controversial casting so that it could make people think more about the fact that this is not the text of the Odyssey. This is his Odyssey. I think it's important to realize when we talk about the Odyssey is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are attributed to this mythological figure Homer, but since the 3rd century AC, there has been doubts of maybe at the beginning was just where he was from, but then in the latest, like in the past centuries, in the last 2 centuries, has been a moral question if he actually existed. And also, Homer, there are some things that point to this. For the fact, for example, that there are many inconsistencies in the text. For example, in the Iliad, a guy dies and then comes back, and also the fact that many the structures of the sentences and the songs are made formulaic. Many of the description are similar or exactly the same, so that easy to as it are chunks that are memorized and to repeat. And other than those stylistic things and plot points things, also there's to consider that in the past the Iliad and the Odyssey were sang by poets, and singing and being a poet didn't only mean memorizing, but also meant becoming an author. In the Odyssey, we see that when Odysseus is in the court of Nausicaa's father, I don't remember his name. There's a poet, Demodocus, um, which is a poet, and there we can see how these poems were recited. He's interrupted, he's asked to continue, he's asked to skip over some part, he reacts to the audience, and in base of that, he chooses how to sing. And secondly, he sings with a lyre, with somebody playing, so there's always music. And at one point, a group of young people start dancing. That was the context.
The role of the poet was authorship. When speaking to an audience, they could change the pace, they could change the events, they could change um, what was happening because based on what the audience wanted, and they could add stuff, remove stuff on will. That's what we think poets were like. They were author in every right. They just didn't write it because scripture wasn't a thing yet.
So I think it makes sense that I really believe in the Homeric question, which is that Homer didn't really exist, but these texts are to be interpreted as a whole civilization, a whole culture that sings about itself, and these stories are to be interpreted as a sort of tribal encyclopedia, which basically means these books were meant to transmit to you. These songs weren't really about yeah, the story is cool, but mostly it was about transmitting to the young people, to the people listening, the values of the Greek civilization, and and how how Greeks are. It's a mirror for it's it's an embellished mirror that the Greeks wanted to see themselves in and pass it down to pass these values. And specifically in the Iliad, we see the myth of the strong warriors. They are very much represent a virtue or a flaw, and that's their job to represent the virtue or flaw. The first word in the Iliad is ire, the angriness, of um, of Achilles, and that's the fulcrum. That's the fulcrum of the story. It's the passions of the man, of men in general. During the Iliad, there's many fighting, whatever. You don't care about this. The Odyssey instead is about the man. The first word in the story is andra, which means man, hero. When we talk about Odysseus, we don't really see the part of him that questions himself, or that he's guilted, as in the movie of Nolan's. We see a man that is supposed to reflect the qualities that a Greek man should have, that is a great warrior, but also that is a great intellect, that can speak in assembly, that is a great communicator, and a great leader. That was what he represented, and he was supposed to be a role model for the people. We don't hear about what happened in the Battle of Troy. We know it was his ideas, but we don't really get a lot about it. We only hear about it by Demodocus, which in he recalls a little bit of the fall of Troy, and that's all we get. And so we don't hear the first perspective of Odysseus in the Battle of Troy, but what do we get from that is crying. He cries, and I think this perfectly, like, I I am writing fan fiction on how Nolan came up with the movie, but I think this is one of the biggest clues in the text that made to um that made it so that the movie was like this. In fact, I think one of the biggest themes of the movie is the difference between the stories we tell ourselves to justify some actions and the actions themselves. We see that people, when they hear songs, it's like they're emotionally detached. Telemachus, when he hears the song about Troy, he knows them, he doesn't feel anything. When he goes to Menelaus in Sparta, and he hears the first account of what happened, he cries. When Penelope hears the songs about Ulysses, he says, I don't want to hear songs about Odysseus. I want Odysseus. Which, incredible, incredible. And I think what is vaguely mentioned in the text, we see that people praise Odysseus for what he did in Troy, for the atrocity that he committed, for the fact that he was the one responsible for letting the Greeks win. And when he hears those magical stories about how great he was, he cries. He cries, and it's never brought up again. But in the movie, instead, we see how different it is to have the story of Odysseus' intellect and Odysseus himself in the movie of the falling of Troy, knowing that he's the cause of the fall, and knowing he's full of guilt. And I really liked this question about the difference between the song, what we sing about men and the men themselves. Um, because also, the story in the movie is not um, exactly the same as is in the story, but I think that fits beautifully in the oral tradition of the Odyssey itself. It was never sang exactly like this, in the same way that it's written here. We lost forever the way that it was sung before, because we don't have any more poets that go around and sing it and add stuff and remove stuff, and we don't know how the ancient Greek sounds. And I think it's great that he decided to not do perfectly everything exactly, because this is the spirit of the story. This story is malleable enough to tell whatever you want to do. This story is malleable enough to tell whatever you want to, and especially this guilt, this feeling of guilt of Odysseus is not present at all in the book, in the story he's a complete menace. He doesn't give about the fall of Troy. And it's really interesting because there are this is perfectly put by this is perfectly put by Eric Doss, which he says that the Greeks have a culture of shame while we have a culture of guilt, in the sense that what when we do something wrong, we feel it, we feel guilt, while in ancient Greece, doing something wrong is only wrong if the collective thinks you did something wrong. Ours is a much more individualistic way of seeing the world and actions, while in Greek society it was collective. An action made sense only in that society and in that moment. So in the book, the fall of Troy is a good thing, even if it's in the first three verses is referred as the sacred city. But it's a good thing that it fell because it was good for the Greeks. So there's no shame to Odysseus for having done what he had to do. In the movie, instead, we see that Odysseus is interpreted by a man that is in a in a in a society of guilt. And since Nolan is an active participant of this society, which feels guilt, he showed Odysseus, he pushed this guilt that is present in our society that wasn't present in the text. And I think it's a beautiful thing because it it made if you interpret it in this lineage of oral tradition, in the sense of retelling the stories to adapt it to the um, issues of the world right now, I think it beautifully represents how much more individualistic the society has been, and how much more it doesn't really matter for people what others sang about you. Odysseus in the movie is almost disgusted. Everybody, even Menelaus, is like, I don't care about the songs. Everybody doesn't like songs. While in the ancient Greece, the defeating time and getting people remembering your name and singing about you was the whole point of doing anything, of valor, of honor. And now, instead, in this society, no, being remembered in history is almost a shameful thing, because most people that are remembered are like, have done horrible things, and these people are trying to battle with the fact that they will be remembered for the whole eternity in their society because of the horrible things they're done. Odysseus will never be remembered. Well, I think he will, but he won't mostly be remembered for the great father he was. He will mostly be remembered for the fall of Troy, for having the idea by Athena of the horse. And he's struggling with that. And that's why in the movie he doesn't want to remember, because remembering would make him feel guilt, which is a thing that does exist in the text. Sorry, I point down because I have a book of the Odyssey, and I reread it, parts of it, after watching the movie, because I was again so fascinated with this connection of the past and the present. And I think the controversial casting of people that are not considered Greek enough, or at all, I think it's a beautiful represents, first of all, that Nolan's movie is not the Odyssey. It's not the Odyssey, the book, but also that it could never be the experience of reading the book, watching the movie, or in the past hearing about it by a poet, are completely different things. Are completely different things. They're not comparable. And I think what he wants to do is like the difference between the medium and the time puts a difference in the story itself. And he telegraphed this modernity of the medium and the story by also making a modern casting, colorblind casting, I think. And I think it's beautiful. It's perfectly represents this the modernity of Nolan's Odysseus. And a lot of people were mad about the mentioning of the people from the sea and the line about the end of the Bronze Age. I don't think Nolan is incredibly great about exposition, and I think the line about the Bronze Age ending was terrible and very weak writing. But I think those words represent how Odysseus not only is his guilt comes from the past. His comes from destroying Troy, but also the guilt of knowing that this is the fall. Odysseus has the knowledge that people, after the Odyssey was written and distributed, people thought that that was the last great era of heroes. And it's like Odysseus has been given the sight of time. He's in discourse with the past of having lost a great past, but also he knows that people will look at him as the last step of a great civilization that will end. Because that's the true. A lot of poets after the Odyssey and like when scripture was invented, they thought that that was the last great battle and the last great idol, and Odysseus is this man between words. We can see it even in the text. Like if you compare the Iliad and the Odyssey, you see that there's differences in the writing that is only explicable by a long time passing, which people say, oh, because the Iliad is like a young Homer and the Odyssey is an old Homer. But I'm gonna go with the theory of Homer not existing. It's just a culture evolving and having new myths, and it makes sense since this is a more evolved man, a more that has had to more skill, that has to meet different people. He has to meet with people that are not civilized, which is probably what was happening in that moment in the Greek culture. They had to expand, and so meet new it was getting bigger and exploring more of the world. Scylla and Charybdis are like in Italy, so they're expanding their horizon.
Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's like Odysseus know he's in a movie. It's like he knows people will be singing about him, and he's struggling with the fact that he's the last hero of this great age. He knows that he will be remembered that way.
Another thing that made me really interested into this adaptation of the movie is that I am always a big proponent for making gods, if you talk about Greek mythology, a big part of the story, because they are in Greek mythology and epics such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. Gods are characters. They talk to people, they convince people, they make deals, they fight, they are present. But if you see it in this eye of wanting to tell the story of the man Odysseus, that which of course he never existed. Troy, the Battle of Troy that lasted 10 years probably never existed. Troy existed, it fell, and it probably inspired the Iliad and the Odyssey. But Ellen didn't exist, whatever. You know the story. But I think being interested into seeing what was behind the man that is being sung about, and how a man could understand being between gods. And it's really interesting to me that the only goddess that is present in the movie is Athena, and all the other gods are mentioned as winds. And interestingly is that Athena is present, and Odysseus believes in her present completely, undoubtedly because of the connection with his wife. But he doubts the power of other gods. Um, he doubts that Poseidon really cursed them after um, blinding the Cyclope. First of all, beautiful inconsistency for a character, because I really like when characters are inconsistent, because humans are inconsistent, and it makes sense that the human behind the sun is inconsistent like that. But also, I think it's like a pin to us that Athena is not really Athena. Zendaya it was to show that she has the appearance of the priestess in the in Troy's temple, and you can justify like that of her like taking the human form of her to like guilt trip Odysseus. But I also like the possibility that that's not Athena, that's a figment of the imagination of Odysseus. In fact, when do we see her? When he's most stressed and at the edge of reality for himself. When he's with Calypso, forgetting and not really understanding what he's doing. We see him when he's arrived to Ithaca. And so he's like is almost waking up. When he's talking to Penelope and like reaching this state of real emotional vulnerability. These are all moments of turmoil in his spirit, and I think it would make sense that his mind would create a personification of his fears, of his doubts, but also like a figure to look up to for help. I love it. I love this idea that Athena doesn't exist. And it makes also sense based on what Athena says to him. Because he's like, why gods never talk to humans like in a way that we can understand? And she's like, who can't understand pain? Who can't understand joy? Who can't see a cloud moving or a bird like flock amassing? And I'm like, yes, so you're not real. You're his brain talking to him, and in this view of the world, that is still Athena doing it. If she says like that, Athena wouldn't come down to talk to him. It's still his brain, and that's why Athena has the image of the priestess. And even if it's not just a figment of his imagination, and is actually Athena coming down to Earth to talk to him about how gods don't speak plainly while she was. It's still beautiful represented how personal of a relation they had with each other. And so much personal that she was present in situation where only he could see her. Because that's real to the text. Athena was always like sometimes would go with Odysseus and be only visible to him. I really liked that the possible deniability of the gods not really existing in Nolan's movies as a physical form, but only being winds and sea, and and almost even more chaotic and petty and belligerent than the the personified version. Because when you have a personified version, you can attribute more will and cause and effect, while if it's only the world, chaos is a big part of it. And I don't know, I really like that Athena was possible deniability of existing or non-existing, and the absence. And also I like the fact that the absence of the gods felt like a presence. The fact that we never saw Poseidon, Hermes, Apollo, first of all, added to the sense of chaos and undesirability, and this mysticism basically of not really knowing what's gonna happen. But also it truly felt that these sailors, that these people were left behind even by the gods. Even them weren't hearing them, which I think added to the ambience, the oppressing ambience of the sea being this unexplored enemy. It was really beautiful. I really liked that. Another thing I liked was the ending. In the ending, in the Odyssey, Odysseus actually, after killing every single one of the guys in the room, except for two, which were like a beggar and I don't remember, but somebody else. So he killed everybody. In this version, he didn't kill everybody, which I think it's a really good difference between men and the man that is sang, like the real man, and the man in the stories. I think, yeah. And also in the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus was able to reclaim his throne, like talking with the fathers of these guys that spent 10 years eating his food, and was able to then become rightful king of Ithaca. I feel like in the movie, the fact that we added guilt into the mix, having a guilty Odysseus would have meant a bad ruler and an impossible situation. Him ruling over other people with that mindset wouldn't have worked. Instead, if since we added guilt to the mix, we have had to create a way to for him to free himself of that guilt. And that exile is exactly how he can look at a new horizon with his wife, to like shed the dishonor of not burning all of the bodies of his companions, and causing all the deaths in Troy, and causing of the horrible stuff like against the god, killing people in temples was seen as a no-no, so he did a no-no. The only way to free himself of that guilt was to exile it, and it makes perfect sense. Another thing that I like that I've seen a lot of people complain about was the episodic feeling of the movie, which is like, we go to Circe, this happens, we go to the Cyclops, this happens, we go to the giants, this happens. But this is pretty much how the book is. It's very much an episode. It's like an adventure book, very much how it feels. So I can't really complain. The one thing I will complain about, that this is the only criticism, the real criticism that I have for this movie, is the role of women. Circe didn't matter at all. She wasn't cool, and you couldn't understand how strong she was, because even the gods feared her. I get there's one line about it, but it's not enough. Calypso was terrible in my opinion. We didn't really get anything from her. It was just a long time of him eating this lotus flower, and that's another story that we skipped. It's fine, but yes, actually I like that he mixed some stories together. The only character is Penelope, and even her is a bit like smaller than in the book, because in the book she also plays this trick, like she doesn't trust him just because of the bow, which cool girl. She also had him like do another trick and brought him into the house, to see the bed. It was really cool. We skipped it, I guess. I think that Nolan threw me a bone with the phrase of, oh, 20 years of the throne are less valuable than the prickle on your chin. 8. What can I fucking say? 8. And I think it's really cool because also Penelope is not like this in the book. She's a cool ass badass, woman that has like subterfuge, but she can talk like that to his son. She can't. She would be stoned or something. The differences between Penelope in the book, Penelope in the sings, the songs that will tell about her, and the real Penelope, which is a badass. And it's also really cool that he called ASAP Rocky. Was it ASAP Rocky to sing? Because actually, I do agree with the rapper thing being the new whatever. They sing with a bass and they come up with the verses. It's exactly what they were doing, but in ancient Greece. And also the fact that they made Odysseus much more less sexual. I think it represents perfectly how nowadays we are very much prudish, more than in the book. And now in the book, basically Odysseus cheats on Penelope with Circe, with the Nausicaa, with the other nymph. Many cheating happen, and the people that listened to this enjoyed it, wanted to know, was juicy gossip, whatever. While now I think it would have been seen as bad. And also, it makes sense, like he wanted to tell the virtuous man Odysseus that didn't have those carnal influences towards these women. At the end of the day, in the story, in the book, Odysseus is a menace, and Nolan tried to make him a modern hero. Maybe we're more boring. I don't know. Also, one last thing while we're editing. Have you noticed how much Odysseus cries in the original text? He's fucking weeping all the time. Because it wasn't shameful to cry. Cry, man, cry. I think there should have been more tears.